Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for stopping by. This is Cheryl. Recently, I've discovered Pink Fresh Studio has stamps, layering stencils, dies, and hot foil plates that all coordinate together, and I've kind of become a little bit obsessed with them. So I have this beautiful set here. I'm waiting for the die for the set, but I just couldn't wait to start playing. So I'm going to use the hot foiling plate as well as the layering stencils. Now, this is the first time I have used my hot foiling plates with some tape, so it took a little bit of adjusting to make sure to tape things in the right place to lift up to put the foil underneath. So I'm going to put it at the bottom here. And I did buy some tape, but I only bought 1/4 inch. I think I need to get a little bit thicker or wider. I think it might be a little bit easier to use, but we're going to use this while we have it. So I've got my hot foil plate facing the paper, and then I'm going to cut the piece of foil that I want to use, and I'm making sure to make sure that it covers the whole plate. Before, while I was still experimenting, getting used to my Glimmer machine, I was kind of cutting smaller pieces just so that I could get used to a little bit without wasting any of the foil. So you see that there's a silver side and a pink side. The pink side is going to face the hot foil plate. You always want to have the pretty side or the colored side facing the hot foil plate. And then we're going to wait for my machine to be ready. So I already have it on. I'm just waiting for the platform ready button to light up, and it's the second green button. I'm going to cut off any excess foil because that's just going to be a waste. I'm going to put it to the side and I'm going to use it for sentiments and stuff like that. So while we're waiting for the machine, this hot foil plate is only going to foil the flower image. And what I'm going to do afterwards, I'll save the excess and I'll use the solid hot foil plate to foil the excess and to create something with that. My platform is ready, so I press the timer button. Once that timer button stops flashing and is solid, I can put it through my Big Shot machine. And I'm going to put it one way and then I'm going to put it back through the other way so that it foils really, really well. The paper that I'm using, the cardstock that I'm using is Hammermill cardstock. I'll link all the supplies that I'm using down in the description below and list them. This is a great cardstock for foiling. I've had great results with it. There's the odd little bit of overfoiling, but you can use a sand eraser just to remove that. This particular one foiled absolutely perfectly. There's a tiny little bit of overfoiling in the top corner there, but that's going to be cut off anyways. The cardstock that I'm using here is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I'm going to be cutting it down for the front of the card. I figured while I had my machine out and hot and that plate was hot, I wanted to see how it would foil on some dark cardstock. So I've got some black here. This is Nina black. Again, I'll put it in the description below because I don't know the exact details to it. I really wasn't expecting much because it's not a really thick or a really smooth cardstock, and I was pleasantly surprised at how well this foiled. It foiled perfectly. There's no overfoiling and it looks gorgeous. I'm not actually going to create a card out of that piece today. I'll put it to the side and I'll create something with it later. It was more of an experiment just to see how that paper was going to foil. So now I'm going to use the layering stencils that match this hot foil plate. And layering stencils are a somewhat new thing. They've been out in the last couple years, but they're a great way to color in images if you hate coloring. I personally absolutely love coloring, but some days I just don't feel like it. And layering stencils are a great way to color in an image really quickly without having to put a whole lot of thought in it. You can just be creative, get some color on paper, and these layering stencils are a perfect way to do it. So you're going to match the stencil with the foiled image on the cardstock. And then I like to tape it in place just to make sure that it doesn't shift while I'm ink blending. Now those pieces of tape that I'm using to tape it in place, I'll be reusing them over and over again throughout this whole thing. So you don't need a new piece of tape each time. I had a little bit of pink on my brush already, and you may have noticed I already had swapped out different pinks. I was second guessing and changing my mind on which color pinks I wanted to use for the flowers. So I'm actually going to be doing that again. I'm using Spun Sugar for the light color, and I'm going to swap out the pink that's there right now, and I'll be doing Kitsch Flamingo for the darker shade. The one that I have on the screen right now is Worn Lipstick, and it's a little bit too coral for what I was wanting. So these stencils are really, really easy to use with blending brushes, and you'll notice that I'm going clockwise as well as counterclockwise. If you only blend your brush one way, you're going to get a buildup of ink just to one side of the stencil. So by changing the direction, you'll get a better coverage of the color. I also, for that pink, I tried to put a darker color towards the center of the flower and a little bit lighter color towards the outside. My next one here is the leaves, and I'm going to use a light green here. This is Bundled Sage, and I'm going to do a really, really light coat, but then go a little bit darker towards the flower as well as on the stems. Places that would normally have a natural shadow, that's where I'm going a little bit darker with the color. My stencil shifted there a little bit, so I'm just adjusting it back to make sure that it's in the right spot. So when I'm stenciling or when I'm using blending brushes, I like to use a really, really light touch to start until I get a feel for how much ink is on my brush. Once I'm comfortable with it and know how much ink is on the brush, I will press a little bit harder. The main thing is if you get too much ink on your cardstock to begin with, you can't lift it off. But if you do use a light touch, you can always add more if you feel that you need a darker color or a darker tone in some areas. And these, I think, look a little bit better when you've got some lighter areas and darker areas. I think it just looks a little bit more natural. So I'm going to be swapping out that color in just a second. The next layering stencil puts some details and some darker lines on the flowers, I believe. Yeah, there we go. So I swapped the color out. Now I'm using Kitsch Flamingo. It's just a better pink tone with the pink foil that I was using, as well as the pink flowers. And once again, I'm doing the same thing, doing some counterclockwise, some clockwise, just making sure that I've got some really nice coverage here. This darker color is just going to add some darker edges to the flowers and in some of the centers. Now, the other thing that you could use if you didn't necessarily have two pinks or two of whatever color you were wanting the flower to be, the second stencil, you could just use a heavier hand when you're stenciling just to get a darker version of the color that you were using before. And you can do that same thing with the green if you want. This green here adds some darker areas to some of the leaf sections as well as the stems. But you could, if you only had one shade of green, you could just use a lighter hand with the first layer and then a heavier hand with the second layer. I would still, even if you're doing that, I would still start with a lighter hand and then just work your way a little bit darker so that you have a little bit of control over the how much color you're putting down. Once again, you don't want to add too much color because you can't lift it back up if it's too heavy. But these coloring stencils are perfect. If you hate coloring, they're a great way to get a quick, easy card without having to put a lot of thought or without having to color. And a great way to do this would actually be to working on several at one time. You could get several cards done in a very short period of time. It wouldn't take you much longer than just doing one card, but it's a fun way to just create in a different way that I personally haven't done it. I've just kind of recently started collecting some of these color layering stencils, and I have to say I'm pretty much obsessed with them. I think they're fantastic. So the last color that I'm using is Scattered Straw, and it just goes in the center of those flowers. Now I like adding some texture and dimension to the projects that I work on. So I have some Glimmer paste that I'm going to be using right on top of that yellow in the center of the flowers. It's just going to add some sparkle. You could also instead just use some stickles or a glue pen and some glitter. I chose to use the Glimmer paste because it's also going to lift up the yellow that I just put down, and it's going to make that Glimmer paste have a yellow tone to it. The inks that I was using were a dye ink, and when you put something liquid on top of them, they are going to rehydrate and they are going to color whatever you're putting on top of them. But for this particular project, I wanted that. Now, after you've used a stencil with texture paste or Glimmer paste, you want to wash it off fairly quickly. So I'm just showing you this here, and then I'm going to put that aside to dry while I go clean off my stencil and my palette knife. I've already taken my image and cut it down. I've got a pink card base, and then I've got a green mat around the edge of that just to bring out the color of the leaves in the image. I'm turning this into a thank you card. So I have a thank you foiled sentiment that I did in a previous video that was extra, and it's foiled with the same color foil. So I'm going to use that on the front of the card, but I'm going to make it a little bit more dimensional. I'm going to take some cardstock scraps and I'm going to cut a few extra pieces to put behind it. And I chose to use green cardstock, the same color green as my mat, to cut those pieces with, so that if you tilt the card to the side, you can see a little bit of green on the back side of, or sorry, on the sides of those sentiments. So I've got my card glued together there. I have an acrylic block on top of it and I'm just putting it to the side. And yes, that acrylic block is not very clean, but it's all permanent ink, so it's not going to transfer to the card. It's not going to ruin anything. While I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm just going to cut those extra sentiments there. The foil or the foil plate that I used for that sentiment has some dies with it to cut the outside out, so you can cut those sentiments out. So I'm just using that outside die to do this. And I was only going to do 2 layers, but then it seemed like the universe wanted me to use 3 because 3 fit in that piece, and rather than have an extra piece of cardstock, I figured we might as well use it up. So I'm using Distress Collage medium to glue all my pieces together here, and I used it for the card base as well. I like using it for gluing things together. I love a liquid glue just because you can shimmy and move things in place, and I really like the Distress Collage medium just because it dries matte and it dries clear. So if anything happens to seep out, you're not going to see that it's there. I've got my green pieces glued all together, and then I'm going to put that foiled sentiment right on top of there. And I'm going to put an acrylic block on there just to hold it in place while it dries. I typically do this so that my hands are free. I can go do other things while something's drying. If I have to hold it myself, I tend to get a little bit impatient and start fiddling with it and working with it. So by doing this, I can just amuse myself with other things for a moment. So that sentiment is dry, the card base is dry. We're going to glue it right on there, and I'm actually gluing it right on top of the flower image. I'm not covering the flowers totally, I'm just putting it kind of in the center of the card. And then I'm going to put an acrylic block on there just to hold that in place for a few minutes while that dries. The liquid glue dries fairly quickly, so it's not something that you have to wait a long time for it to dry. And the other thing is this stuff doesn't warp your cardstock. You don't need to use that much that it would warp your cardstock. So there is our beautiful image there. I love the foiled edges to it, just a little bit of a different change from a stamped edge. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a fabulous day.